Well, good morning again, everyone. Hi, everyone. Amy Wyatt from the Otsego County Conservation Association. We're going to give everyone just a moment to get connected, but while we're doing that, I would like to just remind you, if you have a question during today's presentation, feel free to use the Q&A. Or at the very end, we will open up microphones so you can ask Sam questions directly. We will be using the raise hand feature. So when we open up the Q&A later on, feel free to just use that raise hand feature and I will open up your microphone one at a time to ask the question. So I think with no further ado, I'm going to send it over to Melissa to introduce our presenter.
Sure. Good morning and welcome to week 7 of the 2022 Watershed Wednesday series. My name is Melissa Urich, and I'm a member of the Upper Susquehanna Coalition's wetland team. Watershed Wednesdays are hosted by the Upper Susquehanna Coalition and the Otsego County Conservation Association, and is taking the place of this year's Upper Susquehanna Watershed Forum. These weekly sessions began in September, and next week will be our final in the series. But all of this year's resources, including presentation videos, and those from previous years, are available on the USC's website. Today, our presenter is Sam Beck Anderson. Sam oversees, develops, and administers invasive species prevention and management programs across the 17-county Finger Lakes region as the coordinator of the Finger Lakes Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. All right, take it away, Sam.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Amy. It's so good to be here today. I'm actually in a hotel room right now. I am calling in from Green Bay, Wisconsin at the Upper Midwest Invasive Species Conference. It's been a great conference so far, and I'm just happy to be taking a little break from the presentations to talk to you all today. Thank you for the introduction. Just going to sort of jump right into things and give an overview of sort of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to sort of give a primer on invasive species and kind of how we, the PRISM, interacts with with invasive species and with a number of different partners of all different kinds across our region. And then we'll go into actually managing invasive species, give, again, just a quick primer on this, and then talk about some of the specific invasive species, some of our high priority invasive species for our region, how they impact the Upper Susquehanna watershed, and ultimately what is being done about some of these with some of the programs I'll detail that we have ongoing, essentially. So just to start off, the host institution for the Finger Lakes Partnership for Regional Invasive Species is the Finger Lakes Institute. This is a department of Hobart and William Smith Colleges in Geneva, New York, which is right around here on Seneca Lake. It's a small liberal arts college. The Finger Lakes Institute has a number of different program areas, including nutrient loading, community development, mercury presence, and other contaminants within the watershed, education and outreach, of course, and invasive species. So all these different program areas all essentially are addressed through, like I said, education, outreach, research, and management. All of these different program areas and delivery methods all circle essentially back to the health of the watershed, the Finger Lakes watershed as a whole. The Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. This is a model that is one of 8. Well, we are one of 8 regional partnerships within New York State. This isn't essentially these. It's a great example of an integrated approach to management. We are funded through the Environmental Protection Fund and administered and generally overseen by the New York State DEC as host organizations. These are essentially, the idea is to create a line of communication for data and other information between localized areas and kind of these smaller areas that can head back essentially to the folks in Albany who are making decisions, legislation, management, funding opportunities, things like that. So what we do essentially is working with a number of different partners. This isn't a unique approach to invasive species management. There are just right here in Green Bay at the conference, I've been chatting with a couple of other folks who are running similar types of programs. I think they're called SISMAs here in Wisconsin. It's the same idea. So Cooperative Invasive Species Management Association, I believe is what the acronym is. But this is just a really good way to sort of connect stakeholders on a local level to the bigger picture of invasive species management statewide. We work with tons of partners. The P in PRISM stands for partnership, and that is essentially a huge part of what we do. We couldn't do what we couldn't accomplish all that we do without these, valuable partnerships that have been built and fostered over time. This is just a small selection of some of our partners. We're working with soil and water conservation districts. We worked with Upper Susquehanna on a project the USC this past summer. We're working with U.S. Army Corps, so federal agencies as well, state agencies like the New York State Parks and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. We're working with intermunicipal organizations that are actually hosted as well at the Finger Lakes Institute for Cayuga and Seneca Lakes, and a number of different local lake associations. We work with many lake associations. I just included the Regional Watershed Alliance here to save space with my logos, but essentially what we do, we're working with these folks, providing meetings, allowing them to provide feedback and guide kind of what we do on a bigger picture and how we are approaching very specific and broad invasive species threats and general problems within the Finger Lakes region. So this is a really important part of what we do and how we get a lot of our work done. These partnerships can come in the form of just advising, but also we're working with these folks on kind of co-authoring projects, collaborating on research, management, just general sharing of information, and then of course the grant funding opportunities and just making these connections is super important. So so this is the Finger Lakes Prism here. If you look closely, this is essentially Monroe County up on the northwest over to Madison and Onondaga counties to the east, and then Chenango, and then pretty much all the way down to the border with Pennsylvania. We are the largest prism in the state by area as well as by number of counties. So we have a lot to work with. We have 17 counties and several kind of main population areas, including Rochester and Syracuse, Elmira, Ithaca. So we work with a lot of people. We have a lot of partners to manage. So what we're going to talk about today is, zooming in on the northern part of the Upper Susquehanna or the Susquehanna watershed here. So what we're looking at specifically, kind of looking at the overlap that'll sort of set the stage for what we're really talking about today, and kind of trying to create a connection between the folks that are here trying to learn about the Susquehanna watershed and what we do kind of at a bigger picture. So we are most of Steuben, we're the kind of Steuben County, Chemung, Tioga, Broome, Cortland, and Chenango counties are sort of the biggest overlap that we have with the Susquehanna Basin, but also smaller parts of Tompkins, Schuyler, Yates, Onondaga are other areas where we kind of have, a range and kind of are involved with our scope of interest in terms of regional invasive species problems. So just to sort of jump right into kind of the content of what we're talking about today, invasive species. Invasive species essentially are constantly invading landscapes. They are inserting themselves where they don't belong, essentially, and generally sort of wreaking havoc. These are some good examples of, really a specific species invading landscape. On the top left, this is a Japanese knotweed along a riparian area. Top right is kudzu down south. This is the plant that took the south, I think is the sort of colloquial term for it. This is on the bottom right. This is Japanese knotweed actually persisting directly through a pretty thick layer of blacktop. This is really just a good example of how pervasive and successful these plants are at invading landscapes. So just a brief definition that we sort of accept and kind of, we try to be inclusive. There's a lot of definitions out there that are pretty simplified, but we think this is a pretty comprehensive definition here. So an invasive species is one that is non-native to the ecosystem under consideration and whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or to human health. So anything that kind of falls within this category, we considered to be invasive. So it can't just be, well, it's not from here and it's around, and that doesn't make a plant or animal invasive. It has to actually affect the economic impacts, environmental impact, or actually to human health. So some examples: economic impacts. There is overlap here a lot. If you kind of think about a lot of these problems, which I've noticed over the years, we're still sort of looking at, invasive species management from sort of like a human-based perspective. So if you look at these, this is, a lot of what we are trying to protect does have a human interest, but ultimately we are just trying to, in many ways bring back, sustainable environments and sort of conserve and preserve different native populations, native habitats, and so on. So some examples of economics impacts: agriculture, recreation, wood, forest products, trade, shipping, tourism, utilities. Environmental impacts: a lot of invasive species, generally they come in and are disrupting food webs and habitats. So impacts on biodiversity, structural diversity, natural processes, aesthetics, ecosystem functions, and services as well. So, and then human health, plants, invasive species can impact soil, water, and air quality, flooding, injury, and disease, illness. So we'll talk about, touch on many of these kind of as we continue through the presentation here. So what are the characteristics of an invasive species? These are all the things that essentially make a plant or animal able to become, invasive and to create those impacts. So high fecundity, so lots of babies. We're looking at something like giant hogweed has, thousands of seeds within one flower that flowers every single year, and all these seeds can spread in any way. So aggressive, they outcompete more valuable native species. So there are plants that are more shade tolerant than some native species and are able to persist in the understory and then ultimately overtake, some of the native understories. Just again, one example of that aggressive behavior or characteristics. No natural predators. So something like an animal, a wild boar or invasive hogs that exist down in the southern tier of New York. There's nothing that's really eating them. We don't have any, characteristic megafauna that are going to take care of those populations naturally. Little to no nutritional value. That goes back to no natural predators as well, with things like plants that aren't eaten by deer, for example. There's a lot of native plants that deer just don't eat, that they would normally control populations, but they just don't eat. And a couple more here. So again, just looking at these environmental and economic damages across New York State. So the second largest threat to biodiversity, of course, second only to, again, sort of looking at this human element, people essentially are that largest threat to biodiversity. So managing invasive species, we've given a little background about what these plants and animals are, but really looking into the invasive species curve is kind of a hallmark for how I describe and kind of talk through in management of invasive species. Essentially, you've got a population here over time going across the x-axis and different levels of an infestation and a population of an invasive species growing. As you increase over time, the area infested increases, and ultimately the cost per dollar to manage these invasive species to meet these different goals, containment, eradication, prevention, are essentially just increase and increase and increase. So the costs become so high where you're not thinking about prevention, you're not thinking about eradication anymore with something like blanking, of course, like a zebra mussel, in the Finger Lakes, for example. This is way over here The population has grown to an area where we're not thinking about prevention, eradication, containment. It's not logistically feasible. It's not, financially feasible. So really what's focusing on what the focus shifts at that point to look at asset-based management and protection. So looking at things like controlling buildup of zebra mussels on water intakes, or infrastructure that needs to be cleaned. So that's really where that comes through. But best chances to manage invasive species, which will be a theme in this conversation, and really is just a theme in general for my take on invasive species, is prevention and eradication. So getting to populations before they get to a point where eradication or containment becomes too expensive. We're really just trying to avoid invasive species from coming here. So prevention equals protection and money saved. A couple of just examples of our prevention programs, which I'll talk more about: watercraft steward programs, education, outreach, and early detection through surveys. So we're trying to get out there and educate people so that they know and become extensions of our employees that are actually removing invasive species and can actually help us kind of extend that effort on their own. So there are a couple of different invasive species eradication and control and prevention methods here. So things like boot brushes, limiting disturbance, encourage helping native communities can help actually prevent invasive species. Mowing, pulling, and cutting roots and planting natives is another way to actually remove and kind of control existing populations. There are, of course, chemical methods, a number of different chemical methods that I've been hearing all about this week for controlling a number of different invasive species. The methods vary depending on the species, timing, and the goals. Biological controls as well is a growing topic that includes introducing insects or grazing animals to actually help control invasive species. So the best management strategies combine two or more of these methods and time applications appropriately. So usually just pulling an invasive species or just, nuking a site with chemicals isn't the best way. Sometimes you have to be doing, you almost always should be including some type of education and outreach into a management strategy. And that's essentially what we do here. So all of this ultimately comes back to prevention and kind of avoiding invasive species coming to an area, which I think is really relevant to sort of where we're at with going back to kind of, we are, the headwaters of the upper Susquehanna. A lot of these plants spread through water and water flow, whether it's overland flow, migration patterns, travel patterns along waterways, and just kind of thinking of that, upriver management or upstream management is really important to thinking about, like, prevention essentially and controlling seed banks and things like that. So this is just a couple of our programs. I'll get into some specifics here, but you see we work with the public a lot. We're working with all different ages and demographics. Different people are interested in helping spread the word about invasive species. We also provide a number of other resources. We develop a lot of these resources on our own or partner with other institutions or programs or service providers that will actually help to, again, extend that outreach and education efforts to sort of further our ability to provide prevention and containment and control of invasive species. So this is a couple of fact sheets that we write. We have put together a field guide of invasive plants and animals. Top left are some invasive species boot brushes. So we have worked with a number of partners to place these around high priority trails in a number of different regions or areas throughout our region. So I'm going to get into a couple of invasive species specifically here. This is not descriptive or reflective of all of the invasive species problems happening in the Finger Lakes Institute or the upper Susquehanna within our region, but it's just a couple of examples that sort of give an idea of some of the different types of management that are going on and some of the outputs and looking actually at some of these species as well. So we're going to first talk about aquatic macrophytes. So these aquatic plants provide habitat for invertebrates, habitat for fish and spawning and food. Also improves in many ways or can improve water quality, again, to sort of support that that healthy habitat, the healthy native habitat, stabilizes sediments, and can indicate water body health. So you can see this is a great example of just overgrowth of underwater ecosystem that is being taken over by invasive species. This is, more of a wetland area on the bottom left here. And it's looking at some of the effects that it can have on waterfowl and other animals. So first off, we're going to talk about hydrilla. This is essentially in our region, kind of the number one existing species of interest for us in the Finger Lakes. We have a couple of populations throughout the region. We'll talk about one of them specific to the Susquehanna, but we also have a couple of populations in Cayuga Lake. This is a submerged aquatic plant with visibly serrated leaves in whorls of 3 to 8, usually 5. These spreads by seeds, tubers, and turions that overwinter. And again, just going back to those characteristics that make a plant very successful. They also grow very quickly. They can grow up to 1 foot a day in some areas. This plant is absolutely wreaking havoc in states like Florida that are spending millions and millions of dollars just to manage the assets that they have. So going back to the very right-hand side of that invasion curve, they're literally mowing lanes in wetland areas just so they can get to point A to point B. They're not trying to manage this. They're not pulling it. They're not treating it chemically. They're literally just trying to, hold on to what they can use. So this is something that we are actively managing through monitoring, as well as a couple of treatments as well. So this is this of course is not the upper Susquehanna, but this is the northern part of our region here. So the main Finger Lakes region. This is Cayuga Lake, where most of the known populations within our main sort of connected Finger Lakes region are. So these are all points where we're actually sampling for hydrilla. So we're not only sampling for the plants themselves, but we're also sampling for tubers to try to evaluate current existing management processes that we're working on. I gotta skip through a couple of these things. This is a treatment site, an overview of a treatment site that we've been working on for a few years and the sampling that occurred there. So we've collected a number of different samples at this. This was a site we found a couple of years ago that was treated for 2 years, I believe, and is now continually being monitored. This is an example of Nanticoke Creek in Owego. This was found by somebody, volunteer that found this. This is an ongoing project. I believe the process is the treatment contract cycle is ending this year, and I'm sure we'll have some results to share from the treatment of these sites in the coming years. Invasive water chestnut. I'm just going to sort of leave these just in the interest of time here. Water chestnut is continually being, we work with a number of different partners on things like volunteer pulls, where we're working with folks to actually remove water chestnut from important areas. This is an overview of the water chestnut. This is the general upper Susquehanna region within watershed within our region. So it is there, and it's something that we are interested in. Again, this plant can travel and physical connection. So managing it upstream is really important to sort of limit the seed bank and limit its capacity to be able to move downstream. So we actually have watercraft stewards as well. So stewards are out there providing education and outreach to boaters, as well as actually removing plants. You can see one of our stewards here. We have had stewards at Whitney Point Reservoir in Dorchester Park in Broome County over the past 2 years. Staffing kind of limited our ability to supply stewards there this year, but over the past 2 years, we've had over 2,000 watercraft inspected, and all of these essentially are possible avenues of spread from or to the region. So this is all really important work that we're doing with watercraft stewards. This is one program I'd like to highlight. This is a volunteer program where we're training folks to identify key invasive species, some of them up here, and actually provide data to us to sort of fill gaps in knowledge and sort of, again, expand our reach of actually detecting invasive species. Giant hogweed, moving into some terrestrials. Giant hogweed is a nasty plant that really is one of the main ones that when we talk about human impact, this can actually harm humans. It can cause a bad rash. There are a number of different lookalikes. It's hard to, it's sometimes if you know the plant, it is easy, but there are a number of different lookalikes. Giant hogweed, we work with the DEC to provide some additional staff for DEC through our funding for their hogweed project through the Division of Lands and Forests. This is a just overview of their season this year. And again, zooming in on the upper Susquehanna, this is really what we're looking at. There are giant hogweed populations here, and there is an important reason where that upstream management to limit seed banks and limit the capacity to spread downstream should be considered. This is another sort of terrestrial sister program to the Macrophyte Survey Program, again, where we are working with volunteers to train them on identifying a number of invasive species and how to sample the trails, which are very specifically good spots to survey due to the number of, the disturbed area essentially, and kind of that successional habitat that it really provides a good opportunity for invasive species plants to grow. So this is another great way to become involved. This is open to the public, and we would love to get some folks from the bottom part of our region involved. So moving right along, spotted lanternfly. This is a really big. This is, if we're talking terrestrial invasive species, this is our really number one at this point, just given its effect that it can have on grapes. So this is a bug that feeds on the sap of a number of different host species, including tree of heaven, grapes, fruit trees, hops, maples, walnuts. What it does is it creates something called ashy mold, I believe is the name of it. This is essentially the fecal matter from the plant after it's feeding on the sap of a plant. That then makes the fruit inedible. So this is decimating vineyards and apple orchards throughout Pennsylvania. This is a general life cycle. This is, really important for us to be looking at. It's essentially, I'll get into the sort of vectors here in a second, but it's a complicated, it's a long, generally complicated to maybe non-entomologist, the life cycle. There are a number of different timing, but is pretty well understood, which makes it helpful to manage and monitor. This is a picture of the one of the early instars and just really how tiny they are. The population started near Pennsylvania and has spread. This is just 3 years ago in September of 2019, and this is the extent of the population now. So it is pretty well established in the Susquehanna watershed, and we can see that it's sort of spreading across these major throughways to the west across Pennsylvania and up 81, essentially, again, through area. So control of spotted lanternfly, just to sort of bring this all together here. There are a number of different control methods. Right now, what we are suggesting is we have distributed a number of different traps. The suggested method from the state at this point is to high frequency trapping, so that we can essentially just monitor where the infestations are happening. Since the preferred host of the spotted lanternfly is tree of heaven, we're also asking folks to monitor tree of heaven. There's a number of ways to get involved with that. Feel free to reach out at the end of the program for more information. So generally takeaways, managing invasive species upstream is important for prevention and EDRR when we're talking about a watershed, focused or a watershed-wide angle in terms of invasive species management. So partnerships are great opportunities. All of these programs that I just outlined occur with partnerships, local partnerships through funding, guidance, logistics, networking. All of these partnerships are totally integral to what we do and how we get our work done in managing invasive species. Existing volunteer programs, like I mentioned, are really great ways to become involved. Feel free to contact us today for more information. how to get involved. I just added a couple of links here. Feel free. We have a ton of great outreach information on our Finger Lakes Invasives.org. And always feel free to call or email with any requests for further information. I hope I covered everything successfully today, but again, feel free to reach out and for more information. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. I know we're right at 10 o'clock, but there we could potentially, so just a couple of quick questions.
Yeah, I have some time for questions if that's
okay. So well, the person who asked them has to jump off, so maybe we get, if you can pop your email in, and we'll try to get those answered and sent off to you. But for everyone else, we can still answer the questions. So the first one is actually, can you just bring up the water chestnut slide again and leave that up for, perfect, and leave that up for folks to take a quick look. And then
yeah,
while that is up, what are the treatments that are used for the hydrilla?
There are a couple. Hold on a second. So we have used a couple of treatments. Are you curious about the chemical treatments?
I think that's kind of where we're leaning, is what was the chemical treatment.
Yeah, so I think fluoridone is one of the main ones, but we're also using there are copper treatments as well that have been depending on the site and kind of the drinking water access and kind of how the area is being used, they will use different types of treatments. I can provide more specifics for we have very specific outputs and kind of details about that I'm happy to share offline.
Fantastic. Yeah, that'd be great. And maybe we can include it in that email to her.
Yeah, and we also do one of the sites that we found on Cayuga Lake, we also dredged. It was a really well contained marina area that was basically a breakwater, a solid piece that was actually dredged as well as treated chemically as well. The dredging is prohibitively expensive, but it was very effective.
Very good. Awesome. We do have another question. Where does EAB fall on your graph?
EAB, emerald ash borer. Yeah. EAB is all the way to the right, unfortunately, in our region. I know other parts of the country, it is definitely at different areas. But for us in our region, there is not much that we're doing actively to manage EAB. There are a number of different, we are still, submitting data on it. We are invasives. IMAP Invasives is the statewide invasive species reporting tool that we use. So there are definitely still people kind of submitting pictures and looking for and tracking EAB and tracking existing populations. But I think really at this point, people are treating their ash that they really want to keep and just trying to control the dead wood that's standing and removing it where it's needed. So it's really just at this point, managing the fallout from EAB, unfortunately.
And in our region, we actually are looking at certain patches to see if any of the ash were able to survive the local attacks, so that we can share that information with some folks, research partners who are looking for resistance. But that's kind of where, we do a lot of invasive work as well. So that's the other thing that we've got going on.
Great. Yeah, I know I think those efforts are happening kind of throughout New York as well. And are definitely, valuable at this point. I know I haven't looked at the most recent research, but I know they're starting to see some younger plants that have sort of survived longer than expected. And they're, hoping that they've just sort of missed the boat, as it were, and might be able to find some correlation there. So I know there's definitely still research continuing, and it's something we keep a pretty close eye on.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I know we went a little bit over today. Please feel free to, and Sam, thank you for a fantastic presentation.
Of course, thank you so much for having me.
And I could sit and talk about invasive species all day, so I think that's why I let it run longer than usual.
Fair enough.
But please, folks, join us next week for our very last Watershed Wednesday of the season. We look forward to hearing from Julie and looking at some tree cover change data and resources. So if you can join us next Wednesday at 9:30 for our last session, that would be wonderful. And thank you again. And Jane, we will email off the answers here. I will send that over to Sam so that he can send some information over. But thank you guys so much. I hope that you have a wonderful day, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
All right, thanks everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.